remember, you all need to take an action individually, but one will be decided upon. So for those of you struggling to read, I'll read it out one time. Decadal outlook for 2011-2020. Temperature. Decadal forecasts show the likelihood of a range of possible outcomes. Forecasts are for average conditions over large regions, like the Western Sahel. The global temperature is very likely to warm, reaching more than plus 0.5 degrees centigrade above the 1971-2000 average, during the 2011-2020 decade. Over central Sahel, the strongest warming is expected and could reach plus 1% centigrade or above. Precipitation. Given the recent precipitation patterns with more wet years compared to the past 3 decades and analysis of model outputs, a decrease up to minus 10% of precipitation is likely over Western Sahel. An increase of precipitation between plus 10% and 20% is likely over Central and Eastern Sahel during 2011-2020 compared to 1985 to 2005 period. I should say that these forecasts were actually developed for us by ACMAD. ACMAD is the Regional Climate Centre for West Africa, and they were willing to play the game. So for the workshop that we did with the Economic Community of West African States, they actually developed some forecasts for us. So this is the one that they created for the decadal outlook, and often we play this exercise at very short time frames, either seasonal, monthly, weekly, daily, and so on. But we wanted to see what the difference would be if we played it at much longer time frames, and thinking about what are the range of options that people could really take at that level. So if I can come back to our willing guinea pigs here, if they could all pass their options to the decider for this round. You are a regional disaster risk manager for Economic Community of West African States. What is one possible priority action that you would take with that forecast? And you've got very little time now. And what I will then ask the decider for the round to do is to gather the different options, read them out, and decide on one. That we can then dispute whether she's undertaken the right action or not. So if I'm going to pass it over now to you, you read out the different options of your colleagues.
Okay. So one option is prepare for mass displacement, invest in food production in Central and Eastern Sahel. We've got agricultural initiatives that can deal with heat and high rainfall, which is also similar to this one, which is my one, which was to possibly change crops so that you're more resilient to the higher temperatures. And we have a policy option to support cooperation between regions to enable food transfer.
Okay, and which one are you going to decide? There's pressure. Everybody wants to know.
Okay.
9, 8.
We're going to look at some agricultural initiatives.
We're going to look at and anybody want to dispute that?
Look, it was the idea that I put forward, so I really shouldn't dispute it. But with a bit more reflection, I don't think that I've thought about bigger scale or issues that could come up. So I think I've been very local and not thought grander. So I'll just put that out there.
Okay, everybody's being very polite. Does nobody have a different point of view or think that the action was not appropriate?
If your crop fell, what will happen? Then you'll have the rain disaster, the higher temperature disaster, and the...
Need the micro.
if the crops fail, what will happen? Because if you have a higher temperature and the rainfall and a changed livelihood that fails, then you're going to have a much bigger disaster than just the weather change.
Also, anyone watching online who has a view, please do send us your message.
Depending what's meant by agricultural initiative, there's a certain gamble happening here. You're shifting away from something that's working now to something that might work given the new circumstances, if in fact we've guessed right about the new circumstances and the way our new initiatives will be taken up in the local population. I said actually, just prepare for the worst. There's going to be mass displacement, so you just have, So my thought was, we're basically already boned, so let's just prepare for the disaster. Not to say that that's necessarily the right thing, but this is a gamble.
Okay, that's one point of view. We're going to play one more round so that you see how the different opinions occur as you move between different time frames. We're going to play one round at seasonal level, the same process, and this time I'd really like people to think very carefully about how they would use the seasonal forecast. So, we've got a seasonal forecast this time. It's coming in two parts for those people online. For the group, you can have it all together. Again, this was developed for us by ACMAD, the Regional Climate Centre. It's a seasonal forecast. In West Africa, the principal rains occur usually between May and October. This seasonal forecast is issued in May. It's obviously for a future time. It's for 2016, May 2016. There is a map indicating levels of probability, and there is some accompanying text. And I will give you about 5 minutes, if you're lucky, to read the seasonal forecast, identify an action that you would take as a regional disaster risk manager for the economic community of West African states. How would you use this forecast? That's fine. You can put options on the card or in your action that you would like further support in understanding what the climate information is. That is one option. Probably a priority option if you don't understand what it means. Indeed, that is the biggest result of playing this exercise with the economic community of West African states, was that A, policymakers had never seen them before, and B, when they did see them, didn't understand them. When they were explained in a simple way, they got them immediately and could use them. But they had not received them, were not aware of them, and didn't know what they said. Okay, I'm going to press our group here. We've got some donors breathing down your neck, and they want to know what you'd like to do for the next season. So if you can come up with one reasonable option, I'll give you 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The decision maker for this round is this lady here. And your options are?
Guys? We're getting there. We've asked for an extension from the donors.
Okay, I think if you don't really have any ready options. Okay, you've got one.
Okay, we've got two. Good. Okay, so we've got two options. We're going to stock food in a big barn house, or we're going to consult an expert on agriculture. Anyone else? Last minute?
And which of those are you going to take? Which decision?
Stock food. No. Consult an expert.
Okay, thank you very much. You can see that it is an interesting exercise to play because it brings some things very clearly to the forefront. If people don't understand what this information means, why are climate centres producing it? If nobody's using it, what's the point? If we can provide information that people can use and can understand, it's vitally important. And in fact, when we used this forecast scenario with ECOWAS, interestingly, the past seasonal forecast, so at the beginning of the 2013 rain season, the forecast was very similar to this. There was a very high probability of flooding in Mali in May. Guess what? In August, in Mali, there was a flood. Had anybody done anything about it? No. Okay, so we've got key issues here about why are these groups not having time to get together? Why is it that climate scientists, scientists with relevant scientific understanding of risk, are not having the opportunity to engage with senior policymakers, with communities at risk? We need opportunities to bring people together so that we can explore what this information is telling us and how we can use it. And we need to work out how to use uncertain probabilistic information, as Pablo's already made very clear. So if we could give our guinea pigs a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Well, that was fascinating, and we've got more to come. So I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Dominic Kniveton. He's a professor of climate science and society at the University of Sussex. And after starting his career in climate science, Dominic's recent research is focused on decision-making processes in response to climate stresses and shocks, and modeling how individual decisions scale up over a region and country. The recognition of his research has been shown by the invitations he's received to participate in international expert group meetings run by various agencies of the UN and UK government. And we're very happy that he's with us here today. So, Dominic, I'm just going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Right, can we have the next slide, please? Sorry, the next one again. Right, I was asked to explain probably the simplest of the dialogue approaches that Emma has collected. And while agreeing totally with Pablo about games, games are a good way of understanding. I'm going to give the stereotypical lecture-y PowerPoint, so just my apologies. Right, why do we need these dialogue approaches, and in particular this very simple one? And I think here, hopefully you can see the slide, there's two bits of work that I think illustrate that basically people don't do what scientists imagine them to do, imagine them to take a scientifically rational decision. And the first one comes from the States, where up to 20% of people, although told about a hurricane risk, more than the risk because the hurricane was heading their way and eventually hit them, still remained where they were. That wasn't scientifically rational. They should have left. Instead, a few of them died. Most of them survived, so it probably was the right rational decision. The bottom one shows a paper that, if you ignore the graphs, basically what it's saying is that the expectation is that the more people learn, the more people become scientifically literate about climate change, the more they perceive risk to increase. And actually what was found is that their perception of risk decreased. So the more knowledge people had, the more their perception of risk decreased. So in both cases, people aren't acting scientifically rationally. If we go to the next slide. And the next one again, sorry. Right, now there's various reasons, or not reasons, ways in which people have tried to imagine. This is a word cloud of the ways, the different factors that are supposed to encourage people to uptake science. And if you then click on the next button twice, you'll see the two things that science is really worried about. It's worried about credibility and it's worried about accuracy. You'll see the IPCC reports. The whole of the first report has a big basis in trying to show that climate models are accurate. Unfortunately, users don't really, well, they do care about credibility and accuracy, of course, but that's still, as we've just seen from the previous slide, doesn't mean that they will behave accordingly. So if we go to the next slide, and again hit 2, in the dialogues, one more, if aim, basically the three things that it highlights, I think, are a co-production of knowledge and a two-way communication and trust. And I think that here, this is where, if I go back to Pablo's example with the games, in activating a different part of your brain, and by playing games, removing hierarchies of knowledge. And both the games we've seen previously, the early warning, early action, and Pablo's standing up and watching the frisbee land on the wrong side, is about, to me, removing hierarchies of knowledge, and removing the fact that we have an expert in the room. In my case, I would say it was probably the scientist. Someone else would probably say it was the policy maker in that group that we've just seen in the early warning, early action game. And basically, we removed that space. Anyway, sorry, I thought I was getting a message there. Right, can you go to the next slide, please? No, one more. Right. Now, the IPCC puts this in beautifully academic language. If you don't like the academic language, you can look at the cat falling down, right? And landing on its feet, right, by the way. That was actually supposed to illustrate number one. This is according to the IPCC, beautifully academic language, which, as we know, is just a facade to hide emptiness. So it closes psychological distance. If you're going to communicate uncertainty, you need to do that. Distinguishes between different types of uncertainty, establishes agency, of course, recognises different people's views of risk. And I think that's a key point that has come out in my experience of the dialogues, is that actually risk is subjective. There is idealised risk and there's scientific risk, but essentially risk is subjective. I can say that as an obsessive compulsive. And that emotion is a critical part of judgment, of course, because it is subjective. These games help people develop mental models, ways of thinking. If we move to the next one, I'll actually get, there's not really a game. It's an example. So I've tried this in Senegal and Kenya with Emma. Basically, it's to try and respect other people's ideas of understanding or framing of knowledge. And I think one of the things that's come through for me is Emma's just showed you a forecast, which those three terciles. So the top tercile was the probability of it being an above average rainfall. The middle tercile was it of being normal rainfall, and the bottom one was of below average rainfall. Now, as she said, a lot of people don't get, I hadn't for a long time even worked out what a tercile was, so probably that displays more my ignorance. But the way in which we're trying to get people to use those probabilities, also the science actually, I'll whisper it quietly, it's more than uncertain. You could say that it has a level of lack of knowledge in there that is not being transparent, as Emma gave you the example with the Aquila earthquake, that needs to be transparent. And quite often people think, so both in Kenya and Senegal, that the forecasts are wrong. And part of the reason they think the forecasts are wrong is because they're probabilistic, but partly it's because they're looking at something that's different from being forecast. So if we go to the next slide, what I, and click on it, sorry, it's one of those annoying ones where I've clicked, right, just stop, go back 2, 3, go forward, sorry, just go forward.
You might be able to do it here.
Okay, no, I don't think you can.
Okay.
Just zoom in until you finish that slide, I'll tell you when to stop. Lovely. Silence is golden. Right, stop. Right, okay. So basically what I did is I took the community groups back to a famous football match in Senegal, where Senegal beat France in the beginning of the first match of the World Cup, and very fearful of the gender implications of using a football match to illustrate local and scientific knowledge. I was lucky enough to find that the head of the Women's Federation was the only one who could remember the score, which was 1-0, by the way, to Senegal. That's the reason I picked it. Right. It just so happened there was a big flooding at the same time, which the scientists was related to the AMO. And I asked them, how did they know the floods were going to occur? And then they went through and they highlighted that top line. So there's various indicators that they took that the floods were going to occur. And a lot of people sort of say, what, strawberry shooting, is that really it? But to me, those are quite valid things. And I think if you want to think of the same thing, in the long term we have swallows arriving telling us it's summer, in the short term we have ants flying around telling us we're going to have thunderstorms. These are not completely out there. I'm not saying whether they're valid or not valid, I'm just asking them. And interestingly enough to me, that this is a mixture of Kenyan and Senegalese examples, that the dragonflies touching the ground was one of their most confident, one of the most vehement, this is definitely the rains are coming. And it actually relies on a different timeline, because it says it's not something that happens in September, it happens 2 weeks before the rain occurs. And so this sort of discussion of what people use for their forecasting system, to me, illustrated, and hopefully illustrated the other policymakers, that people are using a sort of variable calendar. And I think the most extreme example of that is in Niger, where the local forecasters always get the forecast right in one particular area of Niger. And that's because the rains always occur on the 1st of July. And the rains always occur on the 1st of July because it's the 1st of July when the rains come. I then asked them to have various levels of confidence in these, and they said they had total confidence in them. The example was to then show, which is the bottom line, scientific products. So scientific products that I spent my early part of my career trying to make, going from daily forecasts, weekly forecasts, 2-week forecasts, monthly forecasts and seasonal forecasts, and then explained what my confidence was in those. And if we switch to the next slide and probably click umpteen million times, sorry about this, Tanya. If you're really lucky, you'll see there's different asterisks underneath them. Basically, I was saying I trust the daily forecast. I don't really trust so much the weekly forecast. And when it gets to the 2 weekly forecast, I really don't trust it at all, to be frank. For some bizarre reason best known to myself, I start to trust it again more when it moves to the seasonal forecast. So I was saying there was a variation in time of how much I trust the forecasts. This allowed people to then discuss about how much they trusted their forecast. The strawberries they didn't trust, they did trust the dragonflies. They had some confidence in the migration of bees, little confidence in the sacrifice of goat, and quite a lot of sacrifice of the moon, that would be clever. Quite a lot of confidence in the inclination of the new moon. Basically what I was trying to draw out from it is that they had exactly the same characteristics as science. That sometimes you trust in these forecasts and sometimes you don't. They also observed that sometimes they trust in them in some locations and not in others. There's no point in looking for bees if there's no bees in that area. If we go to the next slide, what I think this, and click on, sorry, what this allowed, we'll go back one, us to do is then introduce not only these similarities between science and local knowledge, but to highlight why a forecast of a scientific forecast is actually looking at something different than, say, a sacrifice of a goat is looking at. Bees are looking at. The bees, I'm not trying to equate the different knowledges, but I'm just saying that they were looking at different things, and also to extend this over to much longer time scales where we start to say, actually something strange happens scientifically with decadal forecast compared to a 50-year scenario in your confidence. So the basis of all of this was to try and communicate, or not try and communicate, to start a process of dialogue. And here I think the science is essentially acting as a Trojan horse to a political process. And that political process is that process of dialogue that's occurring where people are losing hierarchies of knowledge, i.e. everybody's knowledge is respected, and they're coming together to think about decisions that they will make collectively, as we just seen in the last game. And just to finish off, hopefully on the last slide, sorry, one more. Click it again, Tanya. Right. So it's a very simple exercise, but the idea is to show that there's different knowledges. I'm not saying which one's right, which one's wrong. And when you compare them, they have some similarities, i.e. they are both uncertain over certain time horizons, and they're uncertain in different areas. But they also have some big dissimilarities. They're looking at different things. There's no point in trying to look at a forecast of rainfall if you measure the success of that forecast of rainfall in terms of what the rangeland looks like. How green is the grass? How nutritious is the grass? You're going to get a mismatch. It's oranges and apples. The process of just discussing different people's knowledges is basically this platform for discussing the uncertainties, but also it just provides a platform for essentially a political process of people making decisions, I mean small p political, making decisions or coming together to make decisions about what they're going to do in response to potential situations. That's
Thanks very much, Dominic. Another perspective on bringing people together and the different knowledge types. We want to leave a bit of time for discussion, some questions and comments and observations, but Emma is going to first tell us a bit about the resources, the resource website.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could just link onto the site. As has been explained at the beginning, this effort is really trying to bring together emerging learning. As you can see, there are people doing these kind of initiatives in various places in different regions around the world, and there doesn't seem to be a place yet where we're really synthesizing that learning. Pablo mentioned the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre has a page on the resources that they do, but there are people outside the Red Cross who are also doing this kind of work. And we really need to try and see how best to pull together emerging learning, because there does seem to be a community of practice which is developing, but has no space really to share emerging understanding about which approaches work. And there's also been very clear from the exercises, I hope, that there is an awful lot of thought that goes into these approaches. They may seem very simple and a lot of fun, but actually what you're trying to get out of them is fundamental change in people's behaviour and understanding, big issues. So while waiting for a community of practice to be established fully, we have developed a web page, a website where we're bringing together the case studies where we've seen effective approaches. So far we've collected 25 case studies, which are here. If I could just get the pointer. Sorry, what does that? How will this? Aha. Right, great. Thank you very much, Tanya. So where are we? So here we are on the home page. And I just wanted to show you just quickly, if you want to have a look at the resource, we'll send around the link, and we'd really welcome your feedback. What we'd particularly welcome is your feedback on the particular case studies, and also if you have particular approaches that you would like to share. We have developed a template of the kind of information that we are trying to collate, and if you would help us with that process. So you can look at the resource in terms of dialogue type. As I earlier mentioned, see this very much as a process of getting access to the information, helping people understand it and know how to apply it. So you can search the resource in that way. You can also search the resource in terms of risk type. So we've looked at a number of different risks. Obviously there are others. If there are other examples, that's great. What we're really trying to do is foster understanding across different disciplines and hazard type. So while a lot of these exercises are looking at climate science, I think a lot of them also equally apply to taking on earthquake risk, volcano risk. Not saying that they're exactly the same approach, but that we can learn from which approaches work in different situations. So if I just show you one of these case studies, we've talked about early warning, early action. And this was developed, as I mentioned, by Aram Tal. So each of the case studies gives you some key information and the aims of the dialogue process, and also gives you an opportunity to download more information which gives you the methodology, the type of instance in which it's been used, and some of the impact. It also gives you an opportunity to link with the author and opportunity to look at resources which document the approach and how it's been used. So I think that's really it. So we leave some time for discussion. But if you would like to have a look around this resource, we'd really welcome your feedback to make sure that it is as useful as possible for the emerging community of practice. And it does link to relevant initiatives which have already sought to pull together learning. So again, if you have examples of other initiatives that you think we should add to the website, we'd really welcome those. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Well, we've had an interesting session today, and for those of you who've attended ODI events before, you'll recognize that this is quite different from what we normally do. So I hope you've enjoyed it. But also, we're now opening the floor. We've got about 35 minutes for questions, comments, observations, and we'd really like to hear them. Also to our online audience, who I hope are still with us. And I know you can't participate in the same way in the games, but I hope that you've been able to participate virtually. So please do, if you have questions or comments, the floor is now open. Very quiet. Oh, we've got someone over here to the left.
I'm not sure who to direct this at, so I'll just direct it at the whole panel. But a lot of the games we looked at today explored issues with forecasts. And Emma, you just mentioned about applicability to geophysical type hazards. So a lot of those can't have or don't have the ability to forecast. So do you have games or tools that you would recommend for those situations that don't include the forecast information?
Okay, are there any other immediate questions? If not, I'll go straight to Emma and others who want to respond. Anyone else? Yes, Bobby. Yes, please.
Just more, I guess, an observation. I was at another event a couple of days ago on ODI, getting lots of stuff about risk, but about the use of the term science and what seems to be, and maybe I'm wrong on this, a focus very much on the physical sciences, whereas understanding risk involves a lot more, if you like, to do with human sciences, behavior, psychology, all of that. I mean, we heard some of that already in the games, and it'd be interesting to know, is there a broader community of science engagement in this than more of the climate, physical science, even the seismologists?
Okay, good question. Martin. And I've also got a question online. Oh, sorry, it was here in the front, Tanya Martin.
Sorry. Martin Barber, former UN. And as a former UN, I haven't heard much about the UN in this. Is UNEP involved at all? Is there anything happening in the UN Environment Programme to link science with development and humanitarian planning?
Okay, another good question. Let me just read out one more and then we'll go back to our panelists. This is from Miwa Hirono from the University of Nottingham. Hello, Miwa. I certainly enjoyed the game and understand the importance of the game. I also like the point that you co-produce knowledge by comparing observations and forecasts. But if you do these kinds of games in the context that people have some skepticism towards the power of the West and its knowledge, they may not think science is universal, doing games with potentially snobby elites in non-Western regions may be regarded as patronizing. Have you come across any problems in this regard? How do you communicate your benign intention? I think I'm going to direct that one, first of all, at Pablo. So, shall we start with that one? Pablo, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the opportunity. So, can games be perceived as patronizing? Well, like everything else, yes, it can. It depends on two things. Depends on how prone to the perception of being patronized a person is. So if you play some games with revolutionary former guerrilla fighters from Central America, anyone coming from outside is likely to be perceived as patronizing. But more relevantly, I think the instances where I, as a facilitator, have noticed this kind of potentially patronizing perception has been mostly, and this is an Argentinian speaking, mostly with Argentinians or with economists. And the reason being that when you portray in the beginning the rules of a game that is a simplified representation of reality, there are individuals who say, I already know what needs to be known. You don't need to come and tell me how it works. And whenever that attitude may exist, we are completely respectful of that. When there is no game, when there is a PowerPoint or a conventional talk, those people can simply tune out and not engage. And when they are asked to engage actively in something that puts them outside of their comfort zone, it is, I mean, this only happened twice in more than 300 sessions. It's not like it happens daily. But, you know, it's perfectly fine. If someone doesn't want to engage in an out-of-the-box activity, I respect that. And I do agree that sometimes games can simplify the complexity of systems to an extent that, that can be perceived as patronizing. Let me show you this little object here. This is what we call the cone of uncertainty. We developed this a while ago when we wanted to represent not known probabilities, but unknown probability distribution functions. So if I throw this up in the air in something like the game you played, and I say, if it falls like this, it's a flood. If it falls like this, it's normal rains. And if it falls like this, it's a drought. What do you think are the chances? Well, there are instances where those who thought it was patronizing, when they confront this, they finally realize the meaning of deep uncertainty when you don't know what it is. So it is our experience that we have to be always respectful of the preferences of players. We have very rarely encountered pushback from community level workshop in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, but we do agree with the questioner that it is very important to test any game or any interactive approach before it is deployed at scale, because it can portray things in an excessively simple way, just like it can portray things in an excessively complicated way. If I may address a few of the other questions.
Sure.
May I?
Yes, please.
Thank you. On the question about the UN system, we are working very closely with the UN World Food Programme, with the UN Development Programme, with some partners at UNEP for West Africa early warning systems, with DIWA, Division of Early Warning and Assessment. And generally speaking, like any large family, the UN family is a complicated family. And some of the things that can be done are being done very well by some aspects or some subcomponents of the UN system. In terms of physical versus human sciences, I think that is a gold mine for climate risk management research. My own doctoral research was on behavioral science, at least a fraction of it, and it is amazing to see how predictable our questionable behavior is. So anyone in the audience or anyone who reads the report who thinks that a social science lens can help us understand how people will process information and turn it into action, that would be most appreciated. We need much more of that. On the first question about games, the ones experienced there being mostly about forecasts, we have many games that are not about forecasts. We have games about gender, we have games about urban infrastructure, we have games about food security, we have games about road safety, where we usually embody the chances of something nasty happening, but the game is not about forecast, it's about decisions. Should you make a decision given what you know? As of now, we have about 35 games, of which maybe 12 are explicitly about helping understand forecasts. The rest are broader than that. And as was mentioned by Emma, the Climate Center is just one of many organizations engaged in intensely interactive things. I should mention one of our key partners has been the Parsons School for Design in New York. They played an important role in the game that Aram shared in the case study. And one example, sorry for taking this long, last one. Upriver, a game that is being piloted in Zambia. It's not a fictional game like the one you played, where we temporarily suspend reality and create a fictional reality in the gameplay experience. The game Upriver engages people in a gameplay experience that happens as they engage with the real world. They monitor the river level here now. Someone else is monitoring the river level now, but upstream 200 kilometers, and they can exchange information via SMS, and they can make predictions about what the river level will be. And that will help them learn about incoming floods. This is a phenomenal new area of growth, what we call engagement games, where games actually relate players to the real world around them. And gameplay happens by trying to transform their relationship to the world. The Emerson College team Engagement Game Lab has been a champion of this attitude, of this approach, and we're looking forward to more, including with whoever is interested among the audience, to try games that happen in the real world and not in the magic circle of fiction. Thanks for tolerating a long answer.
No, thank you, Pablo. That's fascinating. Let me just hand over to our other panelists if anyone would like to comment. Randolph, I don't know if you'd like to comment on any of the questions.
I think the answer is I'd like to, but the question is, should I? Because in a sense, I'd like to just use this opportunity to go perhaps to a different kind of set of issues that implicitly are there, but perhaps don't answer directly the kind of questions that the participants here have asked. One of the things that I do think is a deeply important issue, which I forgot who asked it, but this is the nature of science and what does one mean by the parameter of science. I really do think that in this context, probably there are two types of social sciences that will be so incredibly important, and that is the whole question of social psychology and psychology, to try and get people to understand the sorts of world that they will be living in. And I think that really is a serious request for this kind of analysis and these kind of issues to be brought into that social science realm. And I go back, if I may, to my earlier comments, and that is the kinds of worlds that we can anticipate, the sorts of things that these recent books that I mentioned are bringing out is profound change. But no one is beginning to ask how it happens and what the effect is going to be. And I'd like to, again, get my own twist, if I may, on the quote-unquote snobby elites, which I thought was a really very, very important question. And again, not answering it directly, but let me put it this way. One of the things that I think we find in so many societies, of our own societies, is huge gaps and increasingly large gaps between those who really are vulnerable and what you might call the more resilient, perhaps increasing minority. But the fact of the matter is that the gap is there. One of the extraordinary things is to follow the literature and to see the practice of experts and the way experts alienate the communities that they work for. And that, too, I think is something that we have to be sensitive to. And I think here, again, the importance of the work that Emma and Dominic, et cetera, have been doing is so important, because experts can alienate. And this is no time that one needs to be alienated. I was delighted to hear, Pablo, the amount of UN agencies that are engaged in your work. I would have the following questions. To what extent does the World Food Programme look at the longer-term future in terms of that future, how long-term, and how integrated into other kinds of issues? Is it just about food? Because if it's just about food, then in a sense one gets slightly predictable answers and predictable perceptions of longer term. So I think more and more I would value a UN system that looked and was, if you like, cross-sectoral in its own approaches. And in that context, it would be fantastic if out of the Hyogo Framework for Action and the World Humanitarian Summit, if there were real committed decisions to use the different sectors of the UN to come together as an integrated whole to say we can share information, integrate information, and look to, if you like, a future not in terms of sectoral isolation, but in terms of integrated sectors. So not quite the answers, or not quite answers to the question, but my own version.
No, very, very interesting perspectives. Dominic, would you like to comment?
Yeah.
And before you do, I just want to add one more question that you might want to address. Actually, two. Joanna Olson from CRS, Catholic Relief Services, says, can you speak to the power of games to help bridge power divides between communities and policymakers, stroke decision makers? Wow. Have you used games in these types of mixed groups? So that might be something. And then Jeff Beacon from Pollution Tax Association says, have you tried this approach on UK politicians?
Right. Me, not UK politicians. Although I'm sure Randolph can tell us about that. Sorry, Randolph. You so deserved it. I think in answer to actually to those two questions about the patronising element, it's something I worry about a lot, and I've sort of come to the conclusion that the game is a slightly different question, because the games or dialogue approaches are not the issue of patronising. They are it's the interaction and the participation that's actually the question about, is that patronising? The games are, in a sense, a vehicle, are a process to get to some other level of information. I'm putting that very badly, but I think it comes into the question about the power divides. As in, when with the climate work that we've been doing, essentially, it's not just about trying to get climate science to forecast to local communities. The local communities, in comparing different knowledge types, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some of the local knowledge to the scientists, so that the oral histories, for instance, that the local communities have, the knowledge that they have in detail over space and time scales, can be used in a lot of locations where there actually isn't enough scientific equipment, and there is just not the observations, and so it's in that sense, I think it's speaking to a power divide in my mind, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get you're trying to say basically that you both have a partnership in this co-production of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Emma, before I let you speak, I've got another interesting question which is sort of related from Raj from the IDRC in Ottawa in Canada. How do we deal with knowledge controversies and differences of opinion among scientists / forecasters before initiating any dialogue with the larger community of policymakers and practitioners dealing with risk management? Very often, such controversies within science confuse the larger public and the at-risk communities. So feel free to comment on any of them, but
yeah, all very interesting questions, and I think actually the questions are beginning to answer themselves, which is great. I'll just go back to one of the ones at the beginning about how transferable are these approaches between different disciplines. So the approaches that have been developed for climate science, can they be used for seismology, for earthquake risks? And I think it goes back to thinking about what we're trying to do with these dialogues. What are we actually trying to achieve? We're trying to bring together different communities of practice. We're trying to work out how to use very complex, difficult information. And when we go back to thinking about what we're really trying to do with this, with these approaches, I think the transferability is increased. So, for example, a lot of the case study approaches that we document in the website or that we use today do speak to kind of generic issues about bringing together different groups who speak very different languages, getting a level playing field so that everybody's knowledge counts. Nobody's actually the sole person with the information. It's only by bringing together scientific information with understanding of the local context that we can use science in a relevant way. So I think a lot of the approaches do address power issues, do speak to supporting better use of science across different disciplines, across different hazards. The issue around knowledge controversies, in fact, I mean, I think a lot of scientists are worried about seeming to be divided in their opinions. And clearly there are some levels of uncertainty which are really not interesting to policymakers. I've sat through a whole climate conference not understanding hardly anything besides looking at a series of pretty pictures with dots on them. But actually there are some levels of uncertainty which people do need to know about. We should know that there is a level of uncertainty and we need to know how to use that. So I think there's a question about which levels of uncertainty are relevant for policymakers and which are not. But just more generally, I would say that this kind of discussion really speaks to me to the need to have some space where we're bringing together these emerging different approaches. Yes, we need social scientists to work with natural scientists, and fortunately in the UK a lot of the donors are pushing those kind of collaborative networks, bringing together people who are not used to working necessarily together. but having to learn each other's languages, having to understand each other's ways of working. So social scientists have to work with natural scientists, but they need to achieve impact. How do they achieve impact? They work with humanitarian and development organizations and the partners and communities with whom they work. Otherwise, they can't achieve impact.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments? Ah, yes. We take this gentleman in the front and then the lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Joel Hovenstein, Resilience Advisor at Tier Fund. And my work deals less with the snobby elite than with the jaded practitioner. And their question, of course, would be, many of them have been through exercises that result in clever discussions or aha moments, but in terms of the actual action that follows, if you come back in a few months, that it hasn't actually resulted in change. And I just wondered if, in particular, with the things that we've touched on in a bit of detail today, the early warning, early action game, the knowledge timelines that Dominic was illustrating, what sort of practical changes have we seen from that? What are the examples I could take to my jaded colleagues and say, no, actually, you should try this, because this is the kind of thing that comes out of it?
Thanks, Joel. Very good question.
Hi, my name's Samiko May. My question actually follows on quite well from this. It was looking at the sort of sustainability and the tangible benefits and specific examples of these, but also how to measure them. How are you measuring these impacts? What approaches and monitoring evaluation is going on in this sense?
Okay, any others? Okay, this lady in the front.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the mix of games, activities, and theory. I have one.
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah. Andrea Deary from Bergback, PhD student. I have one observation and one question for you. The observation is the subtitle of your report, which is unlocking the potential of science and technology to enhance community resilience through knowledge exchange. I was wondering, and I was expecting, unlocking the potential of local knowledge. And that's the observation. The question is that, are you working with the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous people climate change assessment program as kind of a parallel to the IPCC?
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's an IPCC-A.
Right. Now we have someone over here, and we have a gentleman back here, and then we'll refer back to our panel.
Hi, my name's Richard Eubank from Christian Aid. I really just had a comment which was about, over the last few months I've been reviewing some of our work on climate services, and I've been presented in Nicaragua, India, with immaculate rainfall records that have been collected by farmer groups, and they're using them to basically make a whole host of key management decisions, as well as feeding them back to climate institutions. But there is a sort of, I think there's a certain reluctance on the part of climate scientists to take on board locally measured work. I was just wondering, it's more of a statement, but I was just wondering maybe what the panel thinks in terms of how we persuade climate scientists to have that sort of, that openness to, to receiving rainfall data and other data from the local level, and maybe there's some sort of certification system or something that can be used. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And then before I go to this gentleman, I'm just going to read out a question from Nicola from DFID. And she asks, what does your research tell us about how we can design products and tools that can reach and assist a wider audience at scale? Okay, and then we'll take this last question. And I know that's quite a lot of questions, but I think we have a wide range of perspectives here on the panel that we can call on. Yes?
Maybe it's a bit related to the last
Could you introduce
question.
yourself?
My name is Thomas. I work with Internews, an NGO that works on improving communication between different actors in society. And mostly not always, but we involve local media in our projects. So the question would be, what could be the role for media in this whole knowledge exchange process? On the one hand, scalability is one concern, but on the other hand, also maybe the question of building the bridges or mediating, because some scientists simply find it difficult to express things in a way that everyone can understand. So is maybe a trained science journalist the better mediator in this situation? And also maybe the opportunity to get input from communities if you have interactive programming, for example, on radio shows where people can call in, things like that. So just wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Interesting question, and maybe even to expand it further. I mean, does the panel think there are opportunities to work together with a network such as CDAC, the Communicating with Disaster-Affected Communities, or maybe you're already doing that? Okay, so I'm actually going to go back to Pablo again first. So can we hear your thoughts on all or any of those questions, Pablo?
I'd like to address all, but I am aware of time, so let me compress. First, on rainfall data and measurements done by non-scientists or by scientists. All farmers are scientists, they just don't have degrees. One of the things that we're aware of is that the standards for data quality as established by, for example, the World Meteorological Organization, involve expensive equipment. And we will always have a trade-off between data quality and spatial coverage. Right now, we are concerned with early warning systems that need data to inform if something's happening here now, something bad may happen later downstream, too much rain. Do we want to have, a super fancy $5,000 weather station everywhere? Well, we want that, but we cannot afford it, and it's unlikely we will be able to afford it. So we are, with partners, engaging more and more in crowdsourcing of data that may be good enough to understand whether a red flag should go up. Beware, something nasty seems to be happening, in northern Uganda. And if the river goes south, then maybe something nasty will happen in a few hours or days in southern Uganda. Crowdsourcing now can be done better with technology. And I don't mean only crowdsourcing of data, but also crowdsourcing of the analysis of crowdsourced data. That's an area that is growing very fast, and we're collaborating with the World Bank Open Data team to see how we can take this further. In terms of Joel's question, concrete evidence, allow me to share one anecdote from our first funded game session in Senegal in 2009. We had a version of the game you played around the table, and there was this table of 5 or 7, including a very senior person from a meteorological service, National Meteorological Service in West Africa, and an illiterate fisherman. They were both at the same table. There were 30 people, and I was facilitating the room, and the senior Met person came to me and said, "Mr. Pablo, we have a problem in that table." And I asked, "What is the problem?" And he said, "They are not doing as I say." Okay, so this scientist, who was not only a scientist but a senior person in his national government, said, "The problem is that they are not doing as I say." And I asked, "So what is the problem?" And he said, "Well, they should be doing as I say." And I said, "Who says so?" He said, "Well, I say so." "So who are you?" "Well, I'm the most important person at the table." Says, "Who?" Well, and he started confronting the noise of his mental model until I asked him, "Can you send the army to force everyone, including the fishermen, to do as you say?" And he said no. And then I said, "Well, then maybe you didn't do a good job at communicating why your idea is so good." It turns out that during gameplay, he realized that the fisherman's idea was actually the best idea. And he changed his mind, and after that, he set up an early warning system, including donating the radio from his own budget for the island community of Dumbabadia, where the fisherman was from. So we see that there's a lot of potential for changed behavior, changed understanding, aha moments, as Joel says. Now, the person who asked the question after Joel, I didn't pick up the name, was asking about impact monitoring evaluation. We need much more of that. I'm now concerned that it's growing fast, it's growing beautifully, but it can grow in the wrong way or in an excessive way. Nicola from DFID is aware of one of the things we're doing in Zambia that will involve games for shaping policy on what research to fund about long-term climate. And we do not get funding to do the research about what we do. We only get funding to do what we are asked to do. And the only way forward for now is to invite university students, masters, PhDs to align what they have to do anyways as academic requirements with what we are doing anyways, given that we have to experiment. The climate is changing, the world is changing, we have to do things differently. We don't know whether it works. So any ideas, especially on the question about networks and media, any ideas available emerging from that crowd in the room and online about how we can add a layer of brain power that is intellectually independent. If you ask me, I will try to be honest, but I also will try to make it look good. I want people who come and examine what is being done with fresh eyes, with critical eyes, and who tell us, look, there was a misunderstanding, and that person is now maladapting. We should learn that before we go too far. I have reason to believe that all the ideas, including the report that Emma presented, are very good ideas, but we need to be more critical in an analytically rigorous way to see whether some of the things that we're scaling up could be dangerous unless we plan for the negative potential consequences. Thank you.
Thanks, Pablo. I mean, I'll just mention before I hand over to Emma, I think in this case, that I don't know if you have links with ELRA, the Enhancing Learning for Research and Humanitarian Assistance, and the Innovations Fund, but these sound like fertile ground for more academic and humanitarian partnerships. Emma?
Thank you very much. And very interesting questions. And I'd answer them by talking about a little bit about the work that we're doing as a result of the exchanges that we did in Senegal and Kenya. We received funding from DFID Kenya to scale up the work as part of a bigger consortium in Kenya. And really, while we saw kind of small, tangible benefits from the exchanges at all levels of the partners, we saw direct improvements for farmers in getting access to information and results, increased yield from farmers. It was all at a very pilot scale. Policymakers also benefited from it, and so did scientists. They were able to produce more relevant information. But the work that we're doing in Kenya now really gives us an opportunity to look at scaling up. How are we going to scale up? Well, there's lots of opportunities to scale up in terms of training the Met Office staff, in terms of training intermediaries, in terms of reaching a much wider audience with using a wide range of communications, including SMS, local, regional, national radios. So each of these partners does have a huge role, but I would really emphasize Pablo's point about the monitoring and evaluation. We need to be very clear about what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to measure it. But I think that already there has been very clear indications of benefits. The question is how we create this two-way process for monitoring and evaluation. So we don't just give the information, we really work out what the benefits have been for each of the partners who are involved in it.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Dominic now, and I wonder if anyone wants to address a question about local media and how that could be used.
I don't.
No.
But I do want to talk to the jaded practitioner. I think that's a great question. To me, I think the thing is, it's all part of a much bigger process. What we're giving is examples that essentially are saying science has been quite absent from participation, and it's bringing science into participation. So if you're looking for the evidence of why that works, obviously participation, there's a lot of evidence that participation works. I would have said, to sort of echo Pablo's behavioural stance, you know, to me, there's a lot that's bringing in, say, from person-centred counselling, even from Carl Rogers' work, years and years ago, about honesty and empathy and building capital like that over a much more sustained period of time that does come from breaking down some of those barriers. So in themselves, I agree, they are just little boxes, but they're part of a process. And I think when we've been participating in those processes that were run with from within country people, and we were being asked to contribute, which sort of goes back to this patronising question earlier, which I think was such a good one. One of the outcomes, of course, was the increased capital, because people were learning from each other about different types of knowledge and different ways of making decisions. But the other one was that they had that network. They had that sort of group mind, I think, rather than group think, that they knew who to contact. And that was one of the sort of the real outcomes, that they knew it was Mrs. So-and-so that I contacted if I needed to know the forecast, or whoever it was. And I think, to me, that breakdown and seeing the human side of people really is one of the big impacts of it. And of course, terribly hard to measure and to show to people. But group mind, I think, was the...
Thanks, Dominic. Well, we're just about out of time, but I'd like to give Randolph the last word.
Oh my God. Okay, fine. Well, listen, just one quick word on the jaded practitioner, which just really fascinates me. And that's a question of who's the practitioner here. So in other words, if we're talking about the non-governmental organizations that are represented here, maybe in a sense, one has to actually understand the major transformations that are going on in the world and realize that your role as a practitioner probably is going to change very fundamentally anyway. But if you want to be a successful practitioner and get away from that jaded world that you know so well, then become a communicator, because that's really what I think one needs in terms of development and humanitarian, if you like, support. That said, very quickly, Wendy, on this issue of the internews question, which I found fascinating. We did, we had two major fora on the media, what we call media futures. And there were a couple of things that came out as consistent themes. The longer term doesn't sell newspapers. The second thing is that, well, people don't buy uncertainty. And in fact, it alienates them. And the third thing is, well, you know, basically, we as journalists have to be certain about what we're presenting. And I think all three of those excuses for not thinking longer term, more speculatively, et cetera, goes to why I think the world of journalism, a bit like, if you like, jaded practitioners, are going to have to realize that there's fundamental change afoot. Basically, the media will have to find a raison d'etre, and that will have to be perhaps in longer term analysis, greater communications, et cetera. I think it's a question of also how it links and feeds into social networking systems, et cetera. So the media is far more complex than we accept now. So Wendy, just, it's a theme that I could go on and on about, but I won't. But let me just put it this way. Fundamental transitions afoot. One of the few justifications left for the media as we know it is to think more speculatively and help other people do so, so that they can survive the future.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think we've raised more questions than we've answered, and there's so much more to talk about. So I hope that as many of you as can will join us for refreshments now in the lounge next door. And I wanted to thank our panelists. Pablo, thank you so much for joining us from Boston and going through that fascinating game. And to Emma for both the paper as well as the wonderful presentation and game facilitation. To Dominic for his insights from the work that he's been doing. And of course, Randolph, his words of wisdom from many years of experience. But thanks to you all for participating. I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks very much.
Thank you.